But many years later he returned, in a black SUV, a billionaire, and did something no one expected. Write in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The morning sun rose slowly over the rooftops of the aging homes that line the streets of Rosewood Heights, a small, crumbling town in the deep American South. It was the kind of place where people still knew each other by name, but where smiles had long since faded beneath the weight of poverty, generational struggle, and broken promises. Paint peeled from the fences, power lines sagged wearily from pole to pole, and the air carried the faint smell of overcooked grease from diners clinging to life on the corners of near-empty intersections. Among the weary inhabitants of Rosewood Heights walked Mary Ann Grace, her steps brisk but quiet, her worn leather bag swinging gently at her side. She was a woman of quiet dignity, her hair tied in a modest bun, her soft blue blouse neatly pressed, though the collar had begun to fray. She'd lived here all her life, and though her father had once begged her to leave for a better place, Mary Ann had chosen to stay. It was not out of duty or stubbornness, but out of belief. A belief in children, in their possibility, and in the idea that education could still change lives, even in a place like this. She stepped through the rusted gate of Rosewood Elementary, a school that had once gleamed with hope and ambition, but now bore the signs of neglect. The roof leaked when it rained, the windows barely shut in the winter, and the playground equipment creaked in complaint. Inside, the floors groaned beneath her steps as she made her way to her classroom. Still, she smiled as she entered the room. Desks arranged in imperfect rows, her chalkboard freshly cleaned, and the faint smell of pencil shavings lingering in the air. To her, this was not a building of defeat, but a battlefield of possibility. As the first bell rang, children trickled into the classroom, yawning, chatting, tugging at each other's backpacks. Mary Ann greeted each of them by name, as she always did, offering smiles, gentle touches to shoulders, and brief questions about their evenings. But, as she scanned the room, her gaze paused at the boy she hadn't seen before. He stood hesitantly just inside the doorway, as if he didn't quite belong there. He was thin, alarmingly so, with a wiry frame that disappeared inside a faded gray hoodie, and pants 2 sizes too large. His shoes were torn at the sides, revealing mismatched socks. His skin was a deep brown, his eyes wide and wary beneath a mop of uncombed hair. He clutched a frayed notebook tightly against his chest as if afraid someone might take it from him. Mary Ann approached him softly. "You must be new," she said gently, her voice carrying no judgment, only warmth. The boy nodded but said nothing. She leaned down slightly, smiling. "What's your name, sweetheart?" He spoke quietly, as if afraid of being heard. "Darius." "Well, Darius," she said, stepping aside, "you're in the right place. Welcome to our class. You can sit anywhere you like." He nodded again and slid into the back row near the window. The other children barely noticed him. 1 or 2 glanced his way, then turned back to their conversations. Mary Ann watched him for a moment longer before returning to the front of the room. The morning lesson passed uneventfully. Darius didn't raise his hand or answer any questions. He kept his head down and his eyes on the desk. But Mary Ann noticed something else. He never opened his notebook, never reached for a pencil. When the other children pulled out their lunches during the break, Darius remained seated, staring at the wall, his hands folded in his lap. She walked toward him slowly, careful not to make him feel singled out. "Did you bring anything to eat, Darius?" He shook his head. "Would you like to come with me to the teacher's lounge?" she offered gently. I have some food I can share." He hesitated, then slowly rose from his chair. She led him quietly through the hallway, past peeling paint and posters from a forgotten literacy campaign, to the small, cluttered lounge where a half-eaten sandwich sat in her lunchbox. She handed it to him without a word, watching as he devoured it in silence. His hands trembled slightly, and he didn't look up until the sandwich was gone. That night, Mary Ann lay awake in bed longer than usual. Her small, modest home was quiet, her teenage daughter, Joy, already fast asleep in the next room. She stared at the ceiling, thinking of Darius. Something about the way he'd looked at her, a mixture of hunger and shame, had lodged in her chest like a stone. She knew that look. She had seen it before in other students, but this time it felt heavier, as if wrapped in something deeper than just poverty. Over the next few days, she watched him closely. He came to school each day in the same clothes. He never brought lunch. His notebook remained blank. The other students began to notice. A few whispered behind his back. Mary Ann shut it down quickly, always stepping in, always watching. Still, she saw the glances, the subtle distancing. Darius, she realized, was completely alone. She began bringing extra food, fruit, sandwiches, even leftover pasta in small containers. She never made a show of it. Sometimes she would leave it on his desk before the morning bell. Other times she would find a way to hand it to him quietly. He never said much, but slowly he began to respond. One day, he answered a math question aloud. Another day, he stayed after class and helped her wipe the board. Then, one morning, he handed her a folded piece of paper, a drawing of a tree with her name written in careful block letters at the bottom. "I like trees," he mumbled. She smiled. "I do, too." Then, one afternoon, as she graded papers, she found herself staring at his test. It wasn't perfect, but it showed effort. He had tried, and considering everything he was facing, that meant the world. But not everyone saw what Mary Ann saw. A week later, during a staff meeting, one of the younger teachers made an offhand comment. "Grace seems awfully invested in that new kid, huh? Darius? You'd think he was her own son." Mary Ann had sat still, face unreadable, but the words had burned. She hadn't thought of it that way. To her, he was simply a child in need. The following morning, she found an anonymous note in her mailbox. "Watch yourself. People are talking." Mary Ann read the note twice, then folded it and tucked it into her bag. She wouldn't stop helping him. Not now. Not when he was finally starting to smile. On Friday, the school held an assembly. Parents were invited. Mary Ann stood near the edge of the auditorium, scanning the rows. Her eyes landed on Darius, sitting alone near the back. His head was down, his shoulders hunched. Then she saw a woman in a wheelchair slowly make her way toward him. His grandmother, she realized. Mary Ann's heart tightened as she watched Darius take her hand and help her to a seat. No one else came. No one else ever did. After the assembly, she approached the woman and introduced herself. The woman's hands were thin, her eyes cloudy, but her voice was strong. "Thank you," she said. "No one's ever looked out for my boy like that. He don't talk much, but I see how he watches you." Mary Ann smiled, blinking away tears. "He's a good boy. He just needs a chance." That night, as she locked up her classroom, she didn't notice the figure standing in the hallway, watching her. A parent, one of the louder ones at last month's PTA meeting. The woman narrowed her eyes, took out her phone, and snapped a photo of Mary Ann slipping a small paper bag into Darius's desk. Then she turned and walked away. Mary Ann had no idea what storm was coming. But for that brief, quiet moment, she believed she was doing the right thing. And sometimes believing was all she had. The weekend came and went in Rosewood Heights as it always did, slowly, silently, and without much change. The town remained suspended in the same state it had been for years, caught between forgotten promises and a deep-rooted fatigue that touched nearly everything and everyone. When Mary Ann returned to school Monday morning, she brought with her not just her usual bag of lesson plans and attendance sheets, but a quiet sense of resolve. The note she'd received the week before still lingered in her thoughts, crumpled now in the bottom of her bag, but its warning had only strengthened her conviction. She wouldn't stop helping Darius, not because it was easy, not because it was safe, but because it was right. Darius arrived late that morning, shuffling into class with the same faded hoodie, head down, eyes heavy with exhaustion. Mary Ann noticed immediately that he seemed even thinner than before, the bones of his wrists sharp against the fabric of his sleeves. She greeted him with a smile, soft but steady, and he returned a nod, sitting in his usual place at the back of the room. She had brought 2 paper bags that day, one for him and one for a girl named Tasha, who had started skipping lunch to share hers with her little brother. Quiet kindness, Mary Ann had learned, was contagious. During recess, she saw Darius sitting alone beneath the old oak tree behind the school. The other children ran past him, shouting and laughing, their energy bouncing off the rusted jungle gym and cracked concrete. But Darius remained still, a book open in his lap, though his eyes weren't reading. She approached him slowly, sitting on the bench nearby, and said nothing for a long while. Eventually, he looked up and said, "My grandma was sick last night. I had to help her get to the bathroom. Then the power went out." Mary Ann's heart clenched. She had suspected as much, that things at home weren't just bad, but unbearable. "Did you eat anything?" she asked gently. He shook his head. She reached into her bag and handed him the extra sandwich she'd packed, wrapped tightly in foil. He took it without a word, but his eyes filled with a quiet gratitude that pierced her. That was the moment she knew her heart was in this too deeply to turn back. Over the next few weeks, Mary Ann's routine quietly shifted. She started leaving home earlier, stopping by the grocery store before school to buy fruit, granola bars, juice boxes. She began packing multiple lunch bags each day, labeling them discreetly, placing them in students' cubbies before the morning bell. Darius always received one, though he never asked for it. In the evenings, she found herself researching nonprofit resources, emailing social workers, trying to find community aid programs that might help families like his. One evening, she drove past the edge of town, following a set of vague directions Darius had given her to drop off some clothes. What she found broke her heart. A collapsing house barely standing, its windows boarded up, its porch sagging with rot. She left the bag by the door and knocked gently, but no one answered. Through the cracked blinds, she saw a sliver of movement, a shadow, and then nothing. Back at school, subtle murmurs began to rise. A few students started to joke about Darius being the teacher's favorite. A boy named Caleb loudly asked in class why Darius always had food when he didn't. Mary Ann deflected the comment and moved on, but the seeds of resentment had been planted. One parent cornered her after dismissal, asking why her son said the teacher gave special gifts to a certain student. Mary Ann tried to explain, gently, carefully, that she was simply ensuring no child went hungry. The parent frowned. "That's not your job," she said, turning on her heel. The principal, Mr. Ellis, called her into his office later that week. He was a tired man with thinning hair and the habit of rubbing his forehead when nervous. "Mary Ann," he began, "I've received a few concerns. Some parents are asking about your relationship with one of your students." She raised her brows, disbelieving. "I'm feeding a hungry child, not breaking the law. I know that, but you have to understand how things look. These are sensitive times. People talk, people assume." She folded her hands tightly in her lap. "So, what do you want me to do? Let him go hungry? Pretend I don't see what's happening to him?" Ellis looked away. "I'm just saying, be careful. The school board is watching. One complaint becomes an investigation, and then—" His voice trailed off. Mary Ann left the office with a pit in her stomach. Still, the next morning, she brought food again. One afternoon, she returned to her classroom after lunch and found Darius standing near her desk. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just staring at a picture frame she kept there. A photo of her and her daughter Joy at the beach years ago. When he noticed her, he stepped back quickly, eyes wide. "It's okay," she said. "That was a good day." He nodded, then blurted, "You're nice." The simplicity of his words, the quiet honesty, struck her harder than any praise she'd ever received. "Thank you," she said, her voice catching slightly. That week, he began staying after school, helping her wipe down desks, sharpen pencils, organize books. They didn't talk much, but the silence was never uncomfortable. She saw his shoulders begin to relax, the tension in his face ease. He smiled more, softly, cautiously, but it was there. One rainy Thursday, Darius handed her another drawing. This one was more detailed, a treehouse high in the branches, a child peeking out from the window. Below it, written in his uneven handwriting, were the words, "A place to feel safe." She didn't need to ask what it meant, but despite these quiet moments of healing, outside forces continued to stir. A group of parents had begun organizing, a small but vocal circle, convinced that Mary Ann was crossing a line. They spread rumors that she was favoring Darius because of white guilt, that she was making the other children feel neglected, that her actions were inappropriate and concerning. Someone printed out the TikTok video and brought it to the next PTA meeting. "She's giving him food, touching his shoulder, spending extra time with him," one woman said loudly. "It's not normal." "I just think if it were a white boy, none of this would be happening," another chimed in. The meeting ended in murmurs and tension. The next day, Mr. Ellis called Mary Ann in again. This time he was more somber. "I have to file a formal report," he said. "It's protocol." Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the chair. "I've done nothing wrong." "I believe you, but my hands are tied." She walked home that evening in the rain, her umbrella forgotten at school, her clothes soaked through. Joy met her at the door, saw her face, and wrapped her arms around her mother without a word. Mary Ann stayed awake that night, staring out the window as rain battered the glass. She knew the line she was walking had become dangerous. She knew the price she might pay, but every time she considered stopping, she saw Darius's eyes. She saw the hunger, the fear, the fragile hope. She could not, would not, abandon him. The next morning, she arrived at school with 2 lunch bags, just like always. As she placed the bag in Darius's cubby, a camera flash went off from the hallway. She turned sharply, but whoever had been there was already gone, and somewhere down the line, the Whispers began to grow teeth. Whispers had always lived in Rosewood Heights, slinking down narrow streets and hanging in the air of church basements, grocery aisles, and barbershop chairs. But now the Whispers had sharpened, taken form and voice, and begun to knock loudly at the doors of the school. Mary Ann once considered her sanctuary. The photograph, taken in the hallway, Mary Ann slipping a paper bag into Darius's cubby, had found its way into the wrong hands. Within days, it circulated among certain parents, accompanied by insinuations too heavy to ignore. The image, by itself, was innocent, but paired with speculation, it became something else entirely. Why is she feeding only one student? Why always that boy? Is she trying to make a name for herself by pitying him? It's not right. There must be more to it. The questions became accusations, and the accusations soon enough became formal complaints. Mary Ann felt the shift before she heard it. The air in the teacher's lounge changed. Conversations fell silent when she entered. Smiles turned into tight-lipped nods. Even Mr. Ellis, who had once greeted her each morning with polite civility, now avoided eye contact. Only a few still spoke to her without caution, and even they did so with lowered voices, as if her name had become something dangerous to say aloud. It was late Friday afternoon when everything changed. The school was quiet, the hallways nearly empty. Mary Ann was gathering papers from her desk when the principal's secretary appeared at the door. "Mr. Ellis needs to see you," she said, avoiding Mary Ann's eyes. Inside the office, Mary Ann took a seat across from Mr. Ellis, whose face looked as though he'd aged 10 years overnight. Beside him sat a woman in a sharp gray suit with a black binder on her lap. She introduced herself as a representative from the district's internal review board. "We've received several complaints, Miss Grace," she began without preamble. "Allegations of favoritism, boundary violations, and potential misconduct involving a student, Darius Carter." Mary Ann's breath caught. "This is a mistake," she said, her voice steady. "I was helping a hungry child, nothing more." The woman nodded, as if expecting the answer. "We're not here to assign guilt. We're here to investigate. For the time being, you are to be placed on administrative leave, effective immediately." The word felt like a slap. "Leave? You'll be escorted off the premises. Please don't return until we contact you." Mary Ann sat frozen. Across the desk, Mr. Ellis looked anywhere but at her face. She rose slowly, as if in a dream, gathered her bag, and walked through the hallway she had once called home. Students peeked from doorways. A teacher's aide lowered her eyes. At the front door, a uniformed security guard was waiting. "The district's orders," he explained quietly. Outside, the sky was cloudless and blinding. Mary Ann stood still for a long moment before walking home, each step heavier than the last. By Monday morning, the local news station had the story. Breaking: Rosewood Elementary teacher under investigation for inappropriate conduct with student. The article was brief and vague, but the damage was swift. Social media lit up with speculation. The comments were cruel, unchecked, and relentless. She was accused of grooming, manipulation, exploiting racial dynamics for personal attention, trying to become a white savior. No one asked for her side of the story. A knock at her door came the following evening. Mary Ann opened it to find 2 officers standing grim-faced on the porch. She didn't resist. At the station, they asked questions she had never imagined hearing in her life. "Have you ever touched the student inappropriately? Have you ever been alone with him outside school? Why did you single him out?" Each question chipped away at her dignity, replacing it with confusion and humiliation. She answered truthfully, honestly. "I gave him food. I gave him books. I tried to help." They didn't believe her. She was released pending investigation, but the community had already decided. Her name became synonymous with scandal. Stores she'd frequented refused to serve her. Friends stopped returning calls. Even Joy, her daughter, began to walk with her head down in public, whispered about at her own school. Mary Ann stayed indoors, curtains drawn. Days passed in silence. She reread old thank you cards from former students. She prayed. She wept. And through it all, she thought of Darius. She hadn't seen him since the day she was escorted from school. His grandmother had called once, leaving a message. "I'm sorry for what they're doing to you. We're moving. Darius can't handle it here anymore." After that, nothing. His desk remained empty. One morning, 2 weeks into her suspension, Mary Ann received a letter. It was from the district board, confirming her termination. The charges had not been proven, but the cloud of suspicion was enough. She was no longer welcome in any public school in the county. The shock paralyzed her. She sat at the kitchen table for hours, the letter clutched in her hand. Her daughter came home from school, took one look at her mother's face, and without a word sat beside her, their silence louder than anything they could say. With no income, Mary Ann was forced to sell the house. They moved into a small trailer on the outskirts of town. Joy dropped out of school temporarily, taking shifts at a local diner. Mary Ann tried to find work, tutoring, cleaning, anything, but her name followed her like a shadow. Rumors continued to circulate. The local paper ran a piece titled, "The Price of Overstepping When Teachers Get Too Close." A former parent accused her of targeting black children for her own guilt. A church where she'd once volunteered asked her not to return. But even in the darkest days, Mary Ann refused to stop giving. She began frying sweet corn cakes in the mornings and selling them by the road. Children from the nearby trailer park would come by, pennies clutched in dirty hands, and she would always slip an extra one into their bag. Hungry eyes reminded her of Darius, and she couldn't turn them away. Some nights she would sit by the window with a journal in her lap, writing not about her suffering, but about hope. She wrote about Darius, how smart he was, how kind, how broken the world had been to him. She wrote about a dream of a school where children like him could come and be fed, seen, and loved. Joy often found her mother asleep at the table, pen still in hand. Winter crept in. The trailer's heater worked when it wanted to. They used blankets, cooked in bulk, saved every penny. Still, there was dignity in their struggle. Mary Ann refused pity. She refused to believe that what she did was wrong. One afternoon, while selling her corn cakes, a woman from her old neighborhood pulled up in a luxury SUV. She rolled down the window and stared for a long moment. "You should have just kept your distance," she said. "Maybe you wouldn't be here." Mary Ann only smiled, steady and soft. "Maybe, but he would still be hungry." The woman drove off. She didn't cry. But that night, after Joy had gone to sleep, Mary Ann knelt beside her narrow bed and whispered a prayer. Not for herself, but for the boy she had once fed, for his safety, for his future, and for the chance that somewhere, someone else would care for him like she once had. She did not know that far away, in a city she had never been to, a boy named Darius was watching the same stars through a dirty window, holding a drawing of a treehouse in his hand, and whispering her name. The cold came early that year, creeping into the corners of Rosewood Heights like a thief. By mid-October, the wind carried a sharpness that bit at the skin, and the trees stood naked and still, their leaves scattered like forgotten stories across the sidewalks. In the small trailer that Mary Ann now called home, every gust rattled the thin aluminum walls, and each night was a battle to keep warm. The heater sputtered like an old man's breath and gave up more often than not. Still, Mary Ann refused to complain. After everything that had been taken from her, her job, her name, her place in the world, she was grateful to have anything at all. They had sold the house within a month of her dismissal. There hadn't been much choice. The bills didn't stop just because her reputation had been shattered. Her pension had been frozen, her accounts under review. Joy had packed up her things without a word and moved into the trailer beside her mother. She worked late-night shifts at the diner just outside of town, wiping tables and smiling through the whispers that still clung to their family name like smoke. Mary Ann began her days before the sun. She fried sweet corn cakes on a hot plate balanced between two chairs, wrapped them in wax paper, and walked to the roadside corner near the gas station to sell them for $1 apiece. Most people passed by without a glance. A few stopped. Children came first, curious, quiet, hungry-eyed, and she always gave them extra. When they tried to pay with crumpled coins or bottle caps, she waved their hands away. "Someone once fed me when I had nothing," one boy said, staring down at his shoes. Mary Ann smiled. "Then you remember how it feels. That's enough." There was dignity in what she did, even if others didn't see it. She had once stood at the front of a classroom, shaping young minds. Now she stood behind a folding table, offering what little she could to anyone in need. It was not the life she had imagined, but it was still a life of service. And yet the shame lingered. The news stories had long stopped, but their shadows remained. People still recognized her. They didn't say her name, most no longer dared, but they knew. They whispered in line at the store, in the pews of church, in hushed voices behind closed doors. Some looked at her with pity, others with disgust. She had learned to endure both. Joy tried to shield her, but there was only so much a daughter could do. She was young, strong-willed, and fiercely loyal, but the weight of injustice had made her quiet. She no longer spoke of college or friends. Her world had shrunk to the size of their trailer and the corner diner where she took double shifts to help make ends meet. One night, after a particularly long day, Mary Ann found her daughter asleep at the kitchen table, her work apron still tied around her waist, her cheek pressed against a notebook filled with math problems. The sight broke something inside her. She gently brushed a lock of hair from Joy's face and whispered, "I'm sorry, baby." She did not expect a reply, but Joy's eyes fluttered open, and without lifting her head, she murmured, "Don't be. I'd do it again with you." Mary Ann turned away, tears stinging her eyes. She continued to write in her journal every evening. At first, it had been a place to keep track of details for her defense, dates, names, interactions. But as time wore on and the legal battle faded into silence, the journal became something else. She wrote about hope, about memory, about Darius. She wrote about the way his eyes had lit up the first time he answered a question in class, about the way he had clutched her sandwich like it was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. She wrote about the drawing he had given her, the treehouse high in the branches, and what it meant to him. Sometimes she wrote letters to him, though she had no address to send them. "I hope you're warm tonight," she would write. "I hope you're somewhere safe. I hope you're still drawing." She never stopped praying. She prayed for strength, for peace, for forgiveness, not from the world, but for the bitterness that sometimes crept into her own heart. She prayed for the courage to keep going, even when her hands ached and her soul felt tired. Occasionally, someone from her past would reappear. A former student approached her at the gas station once, older now, tall and sure-footed. He didn't say much, just handed her a $10 bill and said, "For the lunches you gave me back then." She had not remembered his name, but she remembered his face, the way he used to sit near the window, always humming quietly to himself. Moments like that kept her going. But not all visitors were kind. One afternoon, as she packed up her table for the day, a black SUV pulled up and idled beside her. The window rolled down, and a familiar voice spoke. It was Mrs. Hargrove, one of the most vocal parents from the PTA meetings. She had always dressed in expensive scarves and perfume, so strong it lingered after she left a room. "You really should have kept your distance, Mary Ann," she said, her tone sharp. "If you had just stayed in your lane, you wouldn't be out here freezing like this." Mary Ann didn't respond. She tied her scarf tighter and continued folding her table. "You ruined your life over a charity case," Mrs. Hargrove continued. "He's probably forgotten you by now. They always do." Still, Mary Ann said nothing. The SUV pulled away with a hiss, and she stood there a long time, the wind cutting through her coat, her hands trembling. That night, she wrote again. "I would do it again, even now, even knowing the cost." Joy read the entry the next morning while Mary Ann was out. She didn't say anything when her mother returned. She just hugged her longer than usual. Then, as winter deepened, Mary Ann's name surfaced once more. An article appeared in the local blog, a short piece, mostly opinion, asking why the district had never issued a formal apology. It cited flaws in the investigation, noted that no charges had been filed, and pointed out that her dismissal had never gone through the due process. It didn't say much, but it was enough. People began to whisper again, but this time with questions instead of certainty. Mary Ann paid it little attention. She had stopped hoping for justice. All she cared about now was staying warm, keeping her daughter safe, and helping the neighborhood children however she could. But somewhere far away, in a city of glass towers and endless lights, a name crossed a screen. Darius Carter. He sat at a worn desk in a modest apartment, scrolling through articles late into the night, searching for something he wasn't sure he would find. His hands shook slightly as he clicked on the link. Former teacher Mary Ann Grace speaks for the first time. It wasn't much, a paragraph, a quote, a photo of her at the roadside stand. But it was enough. He stared at her face on the screen for a long time, and when he finally looked away, his hands were no longer shaking. He picked up his phone and made a call. Back in Rosewood Heights, the wind howled through the night, but inside the trailer, Mary Ann slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, unaware that redemption was already on its way. The city buzzed beneath a canopy of light and motion, its pulse steady and unrelenting, a rhythm that Darius had long since learned to navigate. He walked with calm purpose now, no longer the wide-eyed boy from Rosewood Heights, but a man forged in silence, hunger, and tenacity. The office building where he worked stood tall among others of glass and steel, its windows reflecting ambition and urgency. But tonight, he sat alone in his apartment, the walls quiet, the light of his screen casting shadows on his face. He had not slept, not really, not since he saw the article, not since her name appeared again like an echo from a past he never escaped. Mary Ann Grace. He read the article at least 10 times. It was not long, but each word wrapped itself around his memory like a hand pulling him back. There was a photograph of her, older, thinner, but still wearing that same quiet steadiness in her eyes. She stood beside a folding table, a tray of wrapped corn cakes in front of her hands folded, her smile gentle despite everything. The caption read, "Disgraced former teacher finds purpose again through street-side kindness." He stared at that image until it blurred, until his vision filled with moments from years ago, the first time she had placed a sandwich on his desk, the way she had spoken to him without pity, the warmth of her voice, the soft scolding when he hadn't done his homework, the way her eyes never looked past him, but into him, seeing more than what he wore or how he smelled. It was because of her he had not dropped out. Because of her, he had learned to believe he could become something more than a statistic, more than a forgotten file in a broken system. Now, he was the founder and CEO of a rapidly growing tech startup specializing in logistics and supply chain infrastructure for food distribution in underserved communities. His app had secured funding from 2 major investment firms and had recently launched in 10 cities. He had employees, offices, headlines, but all of it felt hollow in the face of what he had just seen. She had given him so much when she had so little, and he had vanished. Not by choice, circumstance had stolen the chance to say goodbye, but still his absence had left her defenseless. The next morning, he called in his assistant. "I want everything you can find on Mary Ann Grace," he said. "Past, present, where she is now. Start with that blog article. Cross-reference school board archives if you have to." His assistant blinked. "Right away. May I ask why?" "She saved my life," he said simply. Within days, he had an address. The drive back to Rosewood Heights was long, the landscape shifting slowly from sprawling suburbs and 6-lane highways to narrower roads, broken fences, and fields turned to dust. The town hadn't changed. If anything, it had shrunk. Smaller businesses, quieter streets, more silence between houses. He parked a few blocks from the trailer park listed in the report. He didn't want to show up in a suit or a luxury vehicle. He didn't want spectacle. He wanted to see her first. Not the crowd, not the cameras. Just her. He found her near the gas station, standing behind the same folding table from the photograph, stacking paper-wrapped cakes into neat rows. She was bundled in a worn coat, her hair tucked beneath a wool hat. People passed her without stopping. A few children lingered nearby, watching her hands, waiting for her silent permission. She handed them warm bundles with a smile. He watched from across the street, heart thudding. It was her. Changed, maybe. Weathered, but her. When the children ran off, he crossed the street and approached slowly. She looked up, her eyes narrowing as she tried to place him. "Hi," he said, voice shaken more than he intended. "You might not remember me." She tilted her head slightly, then gasped softly, her hand flying to her chest. "Darius?" He nodded, eyes brimming. "I'm sorry, it took me so long." For a moment, she simply stared, speechless. Then she stepped around the table and hugged him with a fierceness that broke something loose inside him. He wrapped his arms around her and held on. When they pulled apart, she studied him again. "Look at you," she whispered. "You made it." "Because of you," he said. "Only because of you." He insisted on helping her pack up. She protested at first, then allowed it. They walked together down the road, her steps slower now, more deliberate. She pointed out the small trailer where she lived. He noticed the rust on the steps, the sag in the roof line. Inside, it was clean but cramped, the air thick with warmth and the smell of cooking oil. Joy appeared from the back room, her eyes widening in disbelief. "You're Darius?" she said cautiously. He smiled. I am. She looked at her mother, then back at him. I've heard a lot about you. And I've thought about you both for years, he replied. They sat together that evening, sharing tea and stories. He told them about the shelters, the foster homes, the one librarian who'd let him sleep in the back room between shifts, about the scholarship that finally gave him a foothold, the mentors who helped him build his company. But he always circled back to her, to Mary Ann, and how her kindness had been the beginning of everything. Joy listened quietly, her eyes soft. Mary Ann watched him with pride, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. The next day, he returned with a gift, a cashier's check folded neatly in an envelope. I know money won't fix everything, he said, but I want to help. Please let me. Mary Ann tried to refuse, but Joy placed a hand on her mother's shoulder. Let him, Mama, please. The check was for $100,000. It was enough to pay off debts, fix the trailer, start a new chapter. But Darius wasn't done. He returned to the city and began working with his legal team, reaching out to the media, presenting documentation, personal testimony, and a carefully organized timeline. He hired investigators to retrieve school board meeting records, internal emails, and signed affidavits. Within 2 months, the school district issued a formal public apology. Her record was cleared, her teaching license reinstated. When Mary Ann received the letter, her hands trembled so violently she had to sit down. Joy read the words aloud, tears in her eyes. You're free, Mama. They finally admitted they were wrong. But for Darius, even that wasn't enough. He sat with his partner at a downtown architecture firm, unrolling blueprints for a new facility. He described a vision: bright classrooms, modern libraries, open green spaces, a place where no child would be hungry or forgotten, a place of safety and dignity. I want it named after her, he said, Grace Learning Center. The architect smiled. It's a beautiful name. 5 months later, he returned to Rosewood Heights. This time, in full view of cameras, reporters, local officials, and old neighbors who once turned their backs. He stood beside Mary Ann and Joy on the steps of the newly constructed school. The banner unfurled above them, bold and shining in the sun. Grace Learning Center, a place to feel safe. He turned to her and said, This is yours. Everything started with you. She could not speak, only weep. That night, as the town buzzed with the story of redemption, of justice finally served, Mary Ann sat in her new home, a modest cottage provided by the foundation Darius had established, and opened her journal. I dreamed of this, she wrote, but never thought I would see it. He remembered. He came back. And because of him, I have my name again. I have my life. She closed the book gently and placed it on the nightstand. Outside, the lights of the school glowed softly in the dark. A beacon. A promise. And, in her heart, peace finally took root. The day after the grand opening of Grace Learning Center dawned with a soft blush across the sky, the early light brushing the new building's clean glass windows and sleek metal panels. The school stood like a testament against everything that had once silenced Mary Ann Grace, a monument not only to education, but to truth, perseverance, and the long arc of justice that had finally curved toward her. She stood on the front steps that morning as the sun crept over the horizon, her hand resting lightly on the rail, taking in the quiet hum of a school coming to life. It had been years since she had stood outside a school and felt welcome. Now she belonged to one again, and not just any school. This one bore her name. The campus buzzed with anticipation. Contractors hurried to complete final touches, educators unpacked supplies, and a group of community volunteers worked alongside staff members to hang signs and arrange desks. Darius was there, walking through each corridor with a tablet in hand, noting what still needed adjustment. He moved like a man both deeply at peace and intensely focused, a rare blend born of gratitude and vision. Every corner of the building whispered a piece of his story, but none more than the central mural in the entry hall, painted in warm tones of ochre, blue, and green. The mural depicted a tree rising from cracked soil, its branches sprawling across the length of the wall. Children of every background climbed the limbs, books in hand, joy in their eyes. Beneath the tree sat a woman, her face serene, her eyes lifted toward the canopy. She was not labeled, but everyone who saw her recognized the likeness. Mary Ann's likeness. She had objected at first, modest as always, but the artist, a former student of hers from long ago, had insisted. You planted the seed. This is just the tree. News outlets continued to follow the story. Reporters came and went, asking her questions that hovered between admiration and apology. They wanted to know what kept her going, what she had thought when she was arrested, how it felt now that her name had been cleared. She answered them all with grace and honesty, never indulging bitterness, even when they deserved it. Some of the very same voices that had condemned her now offered praise cloaked in guilt, but not everyone apologized. There were still those who avoided her eyes when they crossed paths. Former colleagues who had once whispered behind her back now mumbled excuses about misunderstandings and pressure from above. She listened without judgment, but held none of it close. She had let go of the need for validation from those who had abandoned her. Her vindication lived not in their contrition, but in the laughter of the children who would soon fill these classrooms, in the respect of her daughter, and in the enduring gratitude of the boy she once fed. Darius's efforts did not end with the school. He established a foundation, the Grace Fund, for educators facing disciplinary action over acts of compassion. The fund provided legal support, emergency income, and public advocacy. Mary Ann became its honorary president, speaking at events across the country, sometimes virtually, sometimes in person, always reminding others that kindness could not be allowed to become a punishable offense. Her first major public address took place at the state capitol, where she was invited to speak before a panel reviewing educational policy. Joy traveled with her, standing off stage with tears in her eyes as her mother walked up to the podium wearing a simple navy dress and an expression that radiated quiet strength. Years ago, Mary Ann began, I gave food to a hungry child. For that, I was suspended, arrested, and publicly humiliated. I lost my home, my career, and nearly my faith. But I did not lose my purpose. That child, Darius Carter, is now the reason hundreds of other children will receive education, nourishment, and hope. My story is not exceptional. It is simply proof of what happens when we choose to see each other not as burdens, but as human beings worthy of compassion. The hall rose in applause. After the speech, messages flooded the Foundation's inbox. Teachers from across the nation thanking her for her courage, students recounting stories of mentors who changed their lives, parents apologizing for things they had once believed. It overwhelmed her at times. The fame, the attention, but she remained rooted in humility, grounded by the simple truth that had guided her all along. You don't have to have everything to give something. Meanwhile, Grace Learning Center flourished. Enrollment tripled within the first year. The curriculum was designed to balance academic excellence with emotional well-being. There were therapy rooms, art studios, mindfulness sessions, and an open-door policy for families struggling with housing, food insecurity, or legal trouble. Teachers were trained to identify trauma responses and were encouraged to act with humanity first, bureaucracy second. Mary Ann spent most mornings walking the halls, stopping in classrooms to speak with students, watching from doorways as teachers guided lessons with care. She learned every name, every face. She brought extra snacks in her handbag just in case. Sometimes she taught guest lessons, literature, creative writing, or ethics. Her favorite lesson was titled The Power of a Small Act. Children gravitated to her. They followed her down hallways like ducklings, confiding in her with worries big and small. She listened with patience and answered with kindness. She was not just their principal. She was their protector, their champion. At home, life became lighter. The cottage she now lived in sat near the school, with a garden out back and a front porch that caught the afternoon sun. Joy re-enrolled in college and began studying early childhood development. She also worked part-time at the school, helping organize community outreach programs. Mother and daughter shared long walks again, cooked dinner together, laughed more freely. Their relationship had been tested, stretched to breaking, but now it flourished in new soil. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sky shift into shades of rose and lavender, Joy turned to her mother and said, "You never let them break you." Mary Ann smiled, reaching for her daughter's hand. "I had you, and I had him. That was more than enough." Still, the journey had changed her. She no longer carried herself like someone afraid to take up space. She stood straighter, spoke more boldly, and walked into each room with the quiet authority of a woman who had survived fire and emerged forged. She no longer sought validation from those in power. She understood now that the true measure of worth came not from titles or degrees, but from how one treated the most vulnerable. A year after the school's opening, they held a celebration on the anniversary. Families, staff, and students gathered on the grounds beneath strings of lights and colorful banners. Music played, children danced, and the air was rich with joy. Darius took the stage and invited Mary Ann to join him. The crowd hushed as he spoke. "She saved me," he said simply, "and because she did, I'm here. Because she did, this place exists. Because she did, hundreds of children will have a chance we never thought possible." Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a framed letter. "This is from the governor's office," he said. "It's an official proclamation. From this day forward, October 5th will be recognized as Grace Day across the state, a day to honor educators who go beyond the call of duty to care for their students." The crowd erupted in applause. Mary Ann stood frozen for a moment, overcome, then stepped forward and embraced Darius. He whispered, "I hope it's enough." She replied softly, "It's more than I ever dreamed." As the music resumed and children swirled in laughter around them, Mary Ann stood in the center of it all, no longer the woman who had been broken by injustice, but the one who had rebuilt something better from its ashes. She had been cast out for an act of kindness, and now that very kindness had reshaped the world around her. In her heart there remained no bitterness, only gratitude, for Darius, for Joy, for the second chance she never asked for but was finally given. She looked up at the night sky, its stars shimmering like quiet promises, and whispered a silent prayer of thanks. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more children in need, more moments where she would have to choose courage over comfort. But she would be ready, because now she knew who she was, and the world did too. Morning light filtered through the lace curtains of Mary Ann's cottage, casting gentle patterns across the wooden floor. The familiar scent of chamomile drifted from the kitchen where Joy hummed quietly while steeping tea, her movements soft and assured. Outside, the garden Mary Ann had tended with careful hands was beginning to bloom. Sunflowers stretched toward the sky, tomato vines curled along their trellises, and the roses she once believed would never grow had burst open in a vibrant display of color. Everything seemed to have taken on new life, as if the land itself had been waiting for her healing. The past year had unfolded like a long exhale, each month unwinding the tension that had gripped her for so many seasons. Where once there had been dread and silence, now there was music and motion. Where shame had made its home, now gratitude lived. She had become something more than a teacher, more than a symbol. She had become an institution of hope. Every morning, she arrived at Grace Learning Center before the students. She moved through the halls with calm confidence, greeting the custodians, checking on the kitchen staff, preparing the welcome table with fruit, water, and notes of encouragement for students who came in tired or troubled. Her presence set the tone. Teachers drew strength from her steadiness. Children lit up when they saw her. There was something in the way she listened, fully, openly, that made even the most hesitant students believe they were important. Enrollment had grown so quickly they had to open a wait list. The surrounding community, once skeptical, had rallied around the school. Parents volunteered regularly, alumni returned to mentor, and civic leaders toured the campus with envy and praise. Every child who walked through those doors knew their name mattered. Every teacher knew their compassion would be defended. It was a place where humanity came first, and Mary Ann was its pulse. She often sat in her small office after dismissal, looking out the wide window that overlooked the playground. Laughter would still echo from those swings and slides long after the final bell. Sometimes she would spot Darius out there too, walking alongside students, asking about their projects, crouching down to listen to a fourth grader's idea for a robotics club, or complimenting a mural a kindergartner had finger-painted. He never forgot what it meant to be seen. Neither did she. On Fridays, they held storytelling assemblies. One child would share something important to them, a story about their family, a fear they'd overcome, a dream they were working toward. Then Mary Ann would speak. Just a few words, sometimes a poem, sometimes a memory, and always she ended with the same line, "You matter. Not just someday, you matter now." Joy had found her own rhythm in the school. She coordinated the enrichment programs, built partnerships with local libraries, managed after-school care, and had just launched a weekend arts initiative that combined music, dance, and writing. She flourished in ways Mary Ann had always known she would, her natural empathy blooming into leadership. Together, they had formed not only a team, but a bond sealed by all they had endured and all they now built side by side. But Mary Ann never let herself forget the cost. There were still nights when the past returned, when memories of the interrogation room, the hollow shame of public judgment, the cold silence of that first trailer night crept into her thoughts. She didn't push them away. She let them come. They were part of the story, too, part of the soil from which this new life had grown. And then there were the visits. It started with a knock on her office door one rainy afternoon. A woman entered, hesitant, her expression tight. Mary Ann rose from her chair, puzzled. The woman stepped forward slowly. "You don't remember me," she said. "My son was in your class, Caleb." Mary Ann blinked, then placed the name. Caleb, the boy who had once teased Darius, who had laughed with the others when he sat alone. "I was one of the parents who complained about you," the woman continued, her voice breaking. "I believed the rumors. I signed the petition. And when everything came out about what you'd gone through, I said nothing. I'm sorry." Mary Ann looked at her, then gently motioned toward the chair across the desk. "Would you like some tea?" They spoke for an hour. It happened again and again. Former colleagues, parents, even a former school board member who had once voted for her dismissal. They came, sometimes with letters, sometimes with just tears. She received them all with calm humility. She asked for no penance. She gave no sermons. She only listened. Sometimes she offered a story of her own. Sometimes a warm smile was enough. One of the more profound moments came when a group of current educators from a nearby district visited the school. They asked for a private session with her, and she agreed. They sat in a circle in the library, a dozen teachers worn thin by bureaucracy and fear, by rules that punished empathy. One of them, a young man with tired eyes, asked, "How did you survive it?" Mary Ann paused. "I didn't always feel like I was surviving," she said honestly. "Some days I thought I was drowning, but I held on to what I knew was right. And I had people who reminded me who I was when the world tried to tell me otherwise." Another teacher whispered, "I think I'm one more bad meeting away from quitting." Mary Ann reached across the table, placed a hand over hers. "Then let us hold you up until you're strong again." That became a mantra repeated across the Grace Fund, which continued to grow and expand. Within 3 years, it had supported over 200 educators across 20 states. It provided training, legal counsel, and a growing online platform where teachers shared strategies for compassionate discipline, inclusive curriculum, and mental health practices. Mary Ann traveled to speak at conventions, sometimes virtually, always with the same calm fire in her voice. But she never left the school. That was home. One spring afternoon, she sat on a bench near the edge of the playground, watching children build a pyramid of boxes for a school art project. Darius joined her, offering a thermos of iced tea. "They keep trying to build higher," he said, watching a box tumble. "They'll figure it out," she replied. "Failure is the best blueprint." They sat in companionable silence for a while. "You know," Darius said softly, "people keep asking when I'm going to start the next big thing. They assume this is just a chapter." Mary Ann smiled. "And what do you tell them?" "That the biggest thing I'll ever build already has your name on it." She looked at him, the boy she had once fed, now a man shaping futures. "And what will you do when people stop needing to be reminded of where they came from?" He chuckled. "Then I'll build something else, but it will always start from here." They looked out across the yard again, where a student had just managed to balance the top box. Cheers erupted. That evening, at home, Mary Ann opened her old journal. The pages had thinned with age, the ink faded. She flipped to the final empty page. "I thought my legacy would be in lesson plans and grade books," she wrote. "But it lives in laughter, in second chances, in every student who finds their voice here, and in one man who came back." She signed her name, closed the cover, and placed the book on the shelf beside photos of Joy's graduation, the school's ribbon cutting, and the mural of the tree. The house was quiet now, but full, not of things, but of meaning. Outside, the campus lights flickered on, casting long beams across the walkways. A banner hung above the courtyard, Grace Learning Center, where every child belongs. And in the window of her study, Mary Ann sat at her desk, writing the first words of a letter to a teacher she had never met. Dear colleague, never stop feeding them, even when it costs you, especially when it costs you. They remember, always. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe for more. Don't forget to watch our next video and explore others on the channel. And please share this